One of the most common gripes people have with libertarianism is this idea that it's not realistic. Outsiders call libertarians idealistic, accusing them of having no understanding of reality. The critics tell the minimal state libertarians, in quotes, something like, even if their pipe dream were to be achieved, corporations would just take over the small state, or degeneracy would run rampant and chaos would rule the streets, etc., etc. So it's no surprise that the anarchists within the broader libertarian movement are accused of being the most naive and childish of all. If you're an anarchist, it's a pretty common occurrence to have people telling you, I was a libertarian at one point and then I grew up. Or something like, I was an anarchist when I was 14 too. Behind these remarks, they have some kind of reason that they don't say outright. Often, they believe libertarians are naive because they're literally incapable of picturing a reality outside their current one. If it exists now, it must exist, so they think. Others just think libertarianism is stupid because they don't understand how a free market functions and just assert that they do. Some use the same argument they use with communism, that it might look good on paper, but it hasn't and can't exist in reality. Therefore, libertarianism is an unreachable goal and is stupid to even attempt to achieve. This video is meant to address the last person, the one who might be convinced if examples of anarchy or libertarianism can be shown to them, and that they have existed and worked as described by the theorists. Now, the people who have voiced that kind of grievance are those who have subconsciously accepted empiricism, which is, this idea that any statements about the world around us that claim to say something about the world are hypotheses that need to be verified, or at the very least, they need to be falsifiable. That said, I've already addressed this line of reasoning and why it's wrong in my video on empiricism. In this video, I'm going to provide these people exactly what they're asking for anyway. An example of libertarianism in action in the real world. In this video, I'm covering the title, The Wild West. The first thing someone will probably say is, that's stupid. The Wild West was part of the United States, which is a state. The people living in the West weren't anarchists. Yeah, that's true. The United States did exist and did technically have jurisdiction over the West. That said, when people were settling in the area in the early 1800s, the state had no practical enforcement ability in the area. This changed periodically depending on what was happening in the broader US at the time, specifically after the Mexican-American War and later the Civil War. As you'll see, both of these events introduced more state presence in these practically stateless frontiers. When the state does begin to develop a presence, it either does nothing at all by codifying already existing rules, or just makes the situation worse. When talking about anarchy, there's several main issues people have that I'm going to focus on. What about outside invaders and war? What about thieves, murderers, rapists, etc.? What about publicly owned utilities like water? What about animal species that could quickly go extinct without any checks? If you're interested in any of these topics in greater detail, read The Not So Wild Wild West by Terry Anderson and PJ Hill, which is what most of this video is based on. Or you can always just leave a comment and I'll try to respond. In order to make this video worthwhile, I'm going to go through each of these points in detail and describe how Westerners managed to overcome or solve these issues in their designated areas. Everybody knows that the people leading the American frontier west were not the first to settle in the area. After all, Native Americans populated the entire area for many years prior to any American or European settlement. So, I have to say something about the Native Americans and their way of life to broaden the understanding of both conflict and cooperation between natives and Westerners. When it comes to Native Americans and their culture and customs and norms and law, much of the common narrative surrounding those things involves some sort of soft communism or environmentalism. From what I've heard, people are taught that natives all lived on common property, living off the land and sharing one another's work, being one with nature, and overall being very wholesome. Then, the white man came in and destroyed and dominated everything the peaceful natives had, oppressing and almost eradicating them. To the believers of this common narrative, the majority, if not all, natives are victims, and the white man is the oppressor. The other common narrative involves the idea that natives were always at war with one another, were extremely violent, and frequently would randomly attack white settlers who didn't do anything to provoke them. Although the second narrative is a little more realistic and closer to the truth than the first, they're both not entirely correct. The natives were not some sort of whimsical communists nor steadfast environmentalists, nor were they some kind of vicious savage that would murder anyone who came near. Instead, natives, and especially earlier on, had rules that governed individual property, rules that weren't really enforced by a strong central authority since one didn't really exist. In order for a society to survive, order has to prevail in some manner over constant conflict. If everyone is constantly in danger of being victimized by their fellow man, they won't be able to reap the rewards of the division of labor and cooperation and will instead be sentenced to a life of bare subsistence, if even that. To minimize this conflict, societies adopt some form of property rules. The rules regarding property that many natives subscribed to depended on their circumstances. In general, the rarer a given thing, the more necessary it became to enforce some individual ownership over said thing, else the thing risked overuse and eradication. So, different native tribes adopted different sets of rules regarding property and ownership. According to law professor James Huffman, in fact, it is not entirely true that Native Americans knew nothing of ownership. The language of the common law of property, like all of the English language, was unfamiliar to them. But the concept of the tenancy in common was not foreign to bands and tribes who claimed and defended entitlements to hunting and fishing grounds. Nor was the concept of fee simple title alien to Native American individuals who possessed implements of war and peace, and even lands from which others could be excluded. Now, I want to emphasize the natives didn't set up property rules regarding everything. For example, vast areas such as hunting grounds or water sources weren't treated as private in these societies due to their vastness. There was no practical reason to divide up an area in which one person's use didn't really affect the other person's use, considering the size of the resource against the size of the tribe. However, like I said before, areas with particularly scarce resources were divided, and rules regarding property were more strictly enforced. For example, the Paiute natives treated most of the land I just described as non-owned. However, in areas where the most important source of harvested food came, the pine nut, property rules were enforced. According to Julian Stewart, an anthropologist, each district owned pine nut territory. Permission to gather nuts was sometimes granted, others, but trespass was resented and led to quarrels or rock throwing. This was the most frequent trouble between otherwise peaceful Paiute districts. According to yet another anthropologist, Steve Langdon, tribes established rules for bear and goat hunting areas, berry and root patches, hot springs, sea otter grounds, seal and seal lion rocks, shellfish beds, cedar stands, and trade routes. The most important thing that I want to focus on with regard to the natives, though, is their hunting styles and how property rules regarding hunting grounds were enforced. Before the horse was introduced, natives would hunt buffalo in large groups so that herds could be effectively taken down. They had several methods to take down the buffalo, the most rewarding, but also most costly, being that of the drive. Essentially, around 150 natives would participate in these massive hunts to try to kill off a herd. However, tribes didn't only congregate in these large groups to hunt buffalo. They also did to deter aggression from other tribes, with the most clear example being the conflicts between the Shoshone and Blackfeet, who we'll talk about more later. Without means of transportation, tribes couldn't really travel that far, and thus large herds of buffalo near some tribes were pretty much treated as theirs, which made this hunting technique work. There weren't very many other tribes attempting to hunt and use the same herd of buffalo. This pseudo-system of property rules radically changed from 1600 to 1740 with the introduction of the horse. Dr. Walker Wyman, a historian, writes, The immediate effect upon the Indians of the acquisition of a few Spanish horses by trade or theft was to discourage what little agricultural work they did, and cause them to rely upon the buffalo more than ever before. With the horse, they roamed for miles, encroached upon others' hunting grounds, went to war, and otherwise became marauders of the plains. Basically, the introduction of the horse radically changed how hunting worked. Now, natives hundreds of miles away from some other tribe's hunting grounds could hunt buffalo before that tribe got a chance, increasing the likelihood of conflicts between those two tribes. Tribal warfare became increasingly more common after this introduction, and with it came the need to change outdated property rules. To reduce these expensive and violent conflicts, tribes began to draw boundaries and sign treaties with other tribes, recognizing their claims. Right after natives became acclimated to the horse, the Europeans began to settle in the Americas, which caused more conflict. So what did the Native-European relationship look like? According to Anderson and Hill, the history of Native-European relations can be sorted into three groups: the initial contact to the mid-1800s, mid-1800s to the late 1800s, and the late 1800s to present day. The first period was by far the most peaceful. In a letter to David Campbell, Thomas Jefferson writes, "I hope, too, that your admonitions against encroachments on the Indian lands will have a beneficial effect. The U.S. find an Indian war too serious a thing to risk incurring, one merely to gratify a few intruders with settlements which are to cost the other inhabitants of the U.S. 1,000 times their value in taxes for carrying on the war they produce. I am satisfied it will ever be preferred to send an armed force and make war against the intruders as being more just and less expensive. A new post extended to the southwestern territory will, I hope, soon open and more regular communication with that country." Secretary of State Jefferson also writes, "I consider our right of preemption of the Indian lands not as amounting to any dominion or jurisdiction or paramountship whatever, but merely in the nature of a remainder after the extinguishment of a present right, which gave us no present right whatever, but of preventing other nations from taking possession, and so defeating our expectancy, that the Indians had the full, undivided, and independent sovereignty as long as they choose to keep it, and that this might be forever." In these early times, settlers treated natives by and large as if they legitimately owned their property. As a result, much of the land first gained by these settlers was gained through trade and treaties, not conflict and warfare as the domination theorists would have it. War was very costly, so tribes and settlers traded. There was no reason for either group to risk life and limb when they would bear the costs in doing so. Instead, they settled on voluntary exchange. This changed when the U.S. state got significantly more involved, specifically with the introduction of the U.S. Army. As you can see here, this table and graph show the number of battles and the number of treaties signed. Each number near the bar indicates the number of treaties minus the number of battles, so the lower the bar, the larger the number of conflicts against the number of treaties. Each number near the bar indicates the number of treaties minus the number of battles, so the lower the bar, the larger the number of conflicts versus the number of treaties. So, as you can see, the number of times violence is chosen as a means of conflict resolution is greater than the number of times arguments or treaties are chosen from the 1840s onward. The 1860s and 70s were particularly violent. So why did this happen? Well, the reason the amount of violence spiked has to do primarily with the introduction of standing armies in the region. The Mexican-American War began and ended in 1846 and 1848 respectively, while the Civil War began and ended in 1861 and 65 respectively. As you can see on the graph, these dates correspond to the rise in violence versus peace. When settlers first began to move westward, they didn't have much of a military presence to guarantee their well-being. As a result, they had to protect themselves, and were discouraged from taking on the costs of violent conflict. When standing armies were introduced in the region, costs were no longer an issue. Now, people on the frontier could outsource those costs on taxpayers, causing them to have a greater incentive to move toward violence. Additionally, much of the army consisted of full-time generals and bureaucrats who depended upon the existence of the army to make a living. After the Mexican-American and Civil Wars were over, then, those members of the army were looking for anything to do to get paid. As a result, they were given the job to quote-unquote protect the settlers, which ended up meaning buying things from settlers, using taxpayer funds to do so, and fighting the natives for them. As you can see in this table, the yearly mean number of battles significantly increased after the Mexican-American Wars and drastically increased after the Civil War. So peace characterized the first period, while violence characterized the second. But what about the third? I'm only going to talk a little bit about the third, since I want to focus mainly on the anarchistic parts of the frontier and not so much on the government intervention part, which is what characterizes the third. So basically, this third period is characterized entirely by government interference. At least in the second period, Native American property rules were adhered to some degree. In the third, the state bureaucrats really introduce themselves and begin dividing up native land for them. In this third period, we get the Allotment or Dawes Act of 1887, which basically allocates reservation land to individual natives. The head of each family received 160 acres of land, while each individual native received 80. Any remaining parcels were to be open to settlers. Through bureaucratic fiat, the amount of land natives could claim as their own was artificially and drastically reduced. It's possible that the natives were laying claim to some land they didn't actually use or border, but the state's legislation didn't reflect that. Instead, they said they could only use some arbitrary amount of land. This legislation, of course, benefited settlers who wanted the land and the bureaucrats who were in charge of allocating this new land. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, or BIA, became the main bureaucratic body that would carve up this land for settlers. Later, it called for and passed legislation that ended this allotment process and froze ownership for people under trustee ownership. This act was known as the Indian Reorganization Act, and it passed in the New Deal, and radically increased the power of the BIA as they were given perpetual control over the lands, which required higher budgets and greater authority. Now, of course, all of this negatively affected the natives living there, as much of the reservation lands were owned by non-natives, and the government bureaucracy was able to dictate how the land ought to be managed. To sum up this section, relationships between settlers and natives were pretty peaceful to begin with, since settlers and natives had to bear the costs of warfare if they chose to solve conflicts with violence. While trade and exchange characterized the early period, violence characterized the next when the taxpayer-funded state army introduced itself. Finally, the state took almost complete control over the situation, rewarding tax-funded bureaucrat parasites at the expense of natives and taxpayers. When the area was controlled or influenced by the state, violence and theft was the norm. When the area was unable to be controlled by the state, peace and exchange was the norm. Although there's plenty of examples of contract enforcement, arbitration, and criminal punishment taking place in the West absent of the state, I think the best examples come from the mining camps and wagon trains. As anyone who has ever taken an American history class knows, one of the key events that took place during the time of the Wild West was the gold rush. Prior to any gold discoveries, land in California and Nevada had little to no value. There was no real reason to take the arduous journey all the way to either area for the common person who could have had a significantly more comfortable and stable life in the East. However, the value of the land skyrocketed when gold was discovered in California in 1848 and Nevada in 1859. All of a sudden, people came rushing in from the East to take advantage of the findings and improve their own lives. From 1848 to 1866, there was no federal body overseeing mining contracts whatsoever. During this period, miners had the opportunity to completely disregard property rights and effectively institute a sort of might makes right set of rules. If Thomas Hobbes were around at the time, he'd probably think that the feverish rush after very scarce resources toward an ungoverned area would result in nothing but mass violence and bloodshed. The Polynesian, a newspaper in Honolulu at the time, wrote, "The sun never yet shone upon a more motley crowd than will be assembled there. We hope for the sake of humanity, peace and order will be preserved, but we confess we tremble for the result upon the morals of the people and the peace of the country. In the confusion which must prevail there for the next 12 months, the law will be powerless, rights will be disregarded, reason dethroned, and brute force will reign triumphant. To the love of gold will be added the maddening influence of the intoxicating bowl. It is idle to speculate upon the result. Time alone can show whether these discoveries will prove a blessing or a curse to the inhabitants of California. As you can probably guess, this bloodshed and strife didn't really happen. Law was not powerless, rights were not disregarded, reason was not dethroned, and brute force did not reign triumphant. Although violence occurred in the mining camps, instances weren't nearly as common as the common myth portrays. According to former U.S. Marine and history professor Roger D. McGrath, violence was generally confined to a few special categories and did not affect all activities or all people. Additionally, he says, crimes most common today, robbery, theft, burglary, and rape, were of no great significance. According to Dr. Umbeck, a professor of economics at Purdue University, while all California gold land legally belonged to the federal government, it appears that there was no economical mechanism with which to enforce their exclusive rights. Gold-bearing land was, for all practical purposes, a non-exclusive resource. Contrary to the television westerns which claim to depict this period of American history, the reported incidence of violence in the California goldfields was remarkably low. Instead of fighting over the rights to mineral land, the miners entered into contractual arrangements which assigned mining rights in an orderly and, as I will show, predictable fashion. These contracts took one of two general forms: land allotment and sharing. The gold land, which was claimed as exclusive property by the group of contracting miners, was called a mining district, and between 1848 and 1866, it is estimated that over 500 separate districts were organized, ranging in population from 4 individuals to 8,000. The kinds of contracts miners would participate in would differ from group to group depending on their personal preferences. At first, most contracts were created prior to the journey west, specifying that each member would pool the gold they found so it could be evenly divided after a session. These contracts didn't really work very well, as it was pretty easy for individual miners to just shirk on the contract and take the gold they mined, especially in larger groups where enforcement was super hard. As a result, the rules people began signing up for changed to fit the land allotment type rule, in which contracts would specify districts that each miner would be entitled to. According to the authors of the Not-So-Wild Wild West, typical contracts specified that, by occupation, each miner could hold only one claim not to exceed 100 square feet, that purchase claims required a bill of sale certified by 2 disinterested persons regarding the validity of the signature and the consideration, that a 5-person jury would decide disputes regarding sales, that a claim could be made by posting a notice of intent to be renewed every 10 days until water was available to work the claim, and that claims were considered abandoned and forfeited if the miner was absent from the claim for 5 days for reasons other than sickness or injury. So rules were clearly created, but were they enforced? Well, many different miners and settlers in the area wrote about the surprising lack of violence and adherence to property rules that took place in the area. According to the journal of a missionary known as Israel Lord, judgment and sentences and justice are too speedily executed here to make stealing profitable. He later writes, I suppose that a common interest here answers to the legal restraints which the laws of the states impose on their citizens. We have here, at least, much less difficulty in business every way than there. If one refuses to pay, another might refuse to pay him. As a rule, all pay as soon as possible. Additionally, the codifying of these contracts into federal law in 1866 didn't affect the gold output whatsoever, as can be seen here. The wagon trains that headed out west is the other great example of this anarchy in action. Unlike the mining camps, there was literally no federal oversight whatsoever when it came to the wagon trains that pushed west. These wagon trains carried around 50 people on average, and most, if not all, of their things. After all, the settlers were embarking on these routes were traveling for months on end to get to their destinations. Theoretically, these trails should be a hotbed for this chaotic form of anarchy that Hobbes would subscribe to. These trails should have been covered with travelers' blood, both from fighting one another and the natives. At the very least, people shouldn't have been able to keep much of their things, considering it could easily be stolen by bandits or members within the group they head out with. These wagon trains should have looked like something out of Mad Max. For one, if Hobbes was right, we could probably guess that people didn't really start moving to the west in the hundreds of thousands, considering the immense threat to their lives and their livelihoods in taking the journey. But as you can see in both of these graphs, the number of people traveling to the west from 1840 to 1860 was pretty high yearly and extremely high cumulatively. in the hundreds of thousands. Okay, that might be a little weird, but it could be explained. I mean, after all, the gold discovery in 1848 explains the huge uptick in settlers in 49 and 50. The dip in 51 and the peak in 52 is still a little weird, though. Maybe most of the travelers just valued the prospect of mining gold and settling in the West far above the risk to their lives and livelihoods. But luckily, we don't just have emigration numbers. We also have first-hand accounts and documents from the time. First, we know members of the wagon trains would form constitutions before they left. If you didn't like the rules, you didn't travel with them. One common form that groups took was known as a mess. Basically, individuals taking part in the mess would allow their property to be used by everyone in the group during their time on the trail, but they retained ownership and it would be returned when they arrived at their destination. This way, useful property could be used appropriately, and it could be held as a sort of collateral in case someone wanted to leave early. According to Terry Anderson and Peter Hill, the mess contract also established procedures for removing the captain in the event that enough members disagreed with his decision. Despite the existence of rules to be adhered to, conflicts did happen, and sometimes they did turn violent. As a result, there was a demand for arbitration and punishment on these trails, which is exactly what was organized. Different wagon trains would help one another catch criminals who attempted to steal others' property, or just provide impartial arbitration to settle some dispute between two other parties. Anderson and Hill quote legal historian and professor of law John Philip Reed. They, emigrants, were neither vigilantes nor regulators acting outside established law, for there was no sovereign command on the overland trail. They were not anonymous lynch mobs enacting vengeance upon individuals who had transgressed some criterion of behavior offensive to part of the community. Just as emigrants believed they had a right and a duty to arrest suspected wrongdoers and to determine their guilt by subjecting them to a trial judged by their peers, so they also believed they had the right to impose a sanction upon those convicted, and it was their civic duty to punish certain criminal acts. Additionally, the authors describe one particular method of dispute resolution, stating, "Another interesting practice for achieving justice was codified in a rule that resolved that in case of any dispute arising between any members of the company, that they shall be referred to 3 arbiters, one chosen by each party and one by the 2 chosen, whose decision shall be final." Okay, this is all nice, but is there empirical evidence for this lack of violence? Yes, although not exactly on the wagon trains in major cities. The 5 major cattle towns in the West, Abilene, Ellsworth, Wichita, Caldwell, and Dodge City, only had 45 homicides from 1870 to 1885. That's 3 homicides a year across 5 major cities. In the article, American Experiment in Anarcho-Capitalism, the Not-So-Wild Wild West, Anderson and Hill write, "In Abilene, supposedly one of the wildest of the cow towns, nobody was killed in 1869 or 1870. In fact, nobody was killed until the advent of officers of the law, employed to prevent killings. Only 2 towns, Ellsworth in 1873 and Dodge City in 1876, ever had 5 killings in any one year." Further, the commonly known tale of Western bank robberies is a total myth. According to historian Larry Schweikart, there were fewer than 12 robberies from 59 to 1900, a period of 41 years. "The record is shockingly clear. There are more bank robberies in modern-day Dayton, Ohio, in a year than there were in the entire Old West in a decade, perhaps in the entire frontier period." On a particularly arduous journey west and in their new homes, these settlers managed to voluntarily come up with and participate in a set of rules that made the journey possible, all without the Leviathan. With people's worries about policing and national defense comes worried about so-called public goods that absolutely must lie in the hands of the state. I mean, what anarchic society could possibly manage water so well that you get free iced tea when you turn on the tap like the water the citizens of Flint, Michigan drink? The Westerners solved this problem too, all without a state. Although unfortunately I'm pretty sure they were not able to deliver on the free Arnold Palmers. Unlike out in the East, water was pretty rare in the arid West. In the East, you might be able to get away with caring little about establishing property rules to water. In the West, it's a necessity. In areas with large amounts of water, diverting water from one large body to some smaller place isn't really an issue for everyone else trying to use the water. In the West, diverting water for agricultural purposes can greatly affect anyone else's water supply downstream. As a result, the people of these arid regions adopted the appropriately named Arid Region Doctrine, in which strict prior appropriation rules were established regarding these sources of water. These rights could be exchanged or used just as any other form of property could be exchanged or used. Essentially, private companies would develop or offer to buy large sums of land where they would run their canals. Since they owned the land that was being irrigated, they had no reason to restrict the flow of water to any piece of land, and they were able to bring the water to areas where it was most necessary without having to worry about people who didn't want a canal built on their property. The Anaheim Colony, Southern California Colony, and San Gabriel Orange Grove Association are all examples of large companies that bought and developed land which needed to be irrigated. In the Anaheim and San Gabriel cases, members would be given access to develop different sections of the land by lottery, while in the Southern California case, the now irrigated land was sold to private farmers. In this graph, the orange line represents the number of acres irrigated with private water, while the gray line represents the number of acres irrigated with government water from 1890 to 1950. Clearly, the government wasn't helping much, even when they did eventually step in. Further, to gain economies of scale, many companies had to become big enough to monitor and develop these large swaths of land. So, farmers formed these mutual irrigation companies in which they would pool their resources together to purchase the necessary property. Outside of private, single-farm ownership, these mutual irrigation companies were the most popular form of organization in 1920 until the state's irrigation districts took over in the 30s. I'm not going to go super into detail about the irrigation districts, but essentially, the state began to offer their violent services to people in the 80s by allowing communities to vote on whether the entire district should pay for irrigation, whether the individuals within the district wanted to or not. This, like all government programs of its kind, allowed the people who wanted irrigation to push some of the costs onto people who didn't want or need it. In addition, the Homestead Act of '62, followed by the Desert Land Act of '77, artificially raised costs of creating larger, private irrigation companies because the amount of land able to be homesteaded by one person was artificially limited to 160 acres, and later 640 acres, per person, far too small for a company attempting to irrigate thousands of acres. Then, in 1889, the U.S. Attorney General nullified all land claims after '82 and claimed that homesteading on irrigable land would no longer be permissible, causing the costs for these private companies to radically increase. Finally, with the help of Theodore Roosevelt and the National Irrigation Congress, Congress passed the Reclamation Act in 1902, which officially began state water development projects in the West. Despite all these hurdles set up by the state, private companies still managed to irrigate large swaths of land for people to use. Once again, absent the state and resource wars, private companies and individuals managed to successfully allocate water to the places it needed to go. Another thorny issue people have has to do with nature preserves and things. Why would a private company care about destroying some beautiful, serene piece of nature that didn't do nothing wrong to nobody? As a matter of fact, if you've ever been in a US history class, you probably learned that the frontier people who moved out west tried killing all of these sacred buffalo, but they were stopped by the government before they could execute all of their evil plans, thank God. Unlike every other myth on this list, this one's probably the closest to accurate. Still not in its entirety, unfortunately. In the West, two kinds of furs or hides were important to the early settlers: buffalo and beaver. From 1820 to 1840, the fur trade between the US and Canada was booming. According to Anderson and Hill, expeditions continued throughout the next decade under the sponsorship of the Missouri Fur Company, but the real expansion of the beaver trade began in the 1820s and continued for 2 decades. By 1822, at least 5 major fur companies engaged in trading with the Indians, trapping for themselves or both. Competition was keen, and hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of furs were removed by the Rocky Mountain West. As a result of the wealth that could be gained through trading and trapping, beavers were hunted like crazy. According to a traveler quoted by Anderson and Hill, Indians were wont to hunt in a slovenly manner, leaving a few animals yearly for breeding. but that the white hunters were more thorough-spirited and made root and branch work of it. The consequence has been that there are now few fur-clad animals this side of the mountains. Why didn't these trappers preserve or breed the beaver? The answer is pretty straightforward. The profits of doing so weren't high enough. The cost to erect some sort of barrier around trapping grounds was very costly and practically impossible. Additionally, if the furs weren't harvested near immediately, some other company was just practically guaranteed to come in and harvest them, causing them to earn their revenues. The biggest reason for the lack of profitability of preserving the beavers was the fact that the furs were rapidly going out of style as silk began to replace them. As you can see in this chart, the price for the furs peaked in the late 20s and began to steadily decrease from there. So it made no economic sense to make all the effort to preserve an animal few people demanded. The near extinction of the bison is a much scarier story, however. After all, although 30 million bison roamed the plains before extensive market hunting began, bison were almost totally exterminated by 1886, with only a few in captivity and a very small wild herd in Yellowstone National Park. Why did this happen? For one, most of the bison hunting was done by the natives, unlike the beaver hunting. As I talked about in the first section, the horse allowed Plains Indians to hunt bison like never before, rapidly decreasing their population. Whites also hunted the buffalo, though. But why to near extinction? For one, fencing buffalo in is near impossible. Buffalo herds roamed several thousand acres, an amount of land extremely hard to monitor for intruders, especially when the land itself isn't actually developed. Additionally, federal land laws prohibited fencing the range. Secondly, and more importantly, there was no reason to attempt to breed bison when cattle provided the same resources for a significantly lower cost. Cattle were easy to control, easy to harvest, easy to breed, and easy to transport, all advantages that were lacking in the bison. Additionally, cowhide was worth almost 10 times as much as buffalo hide, so spending the time to attempt to preserve the bison was a complete waste. To add on yet another negative, both the bison and cattle needed to eat the same grass on the plains, so only one could stick around. Obviously, that one was going to be the cattle. That all said, the thing that prevented the buffalo from going completely extinct was not the state, it was private entrepreneurs. Before the federal government got involved, Charles Goodnight, Frederick Dupree, Charles Allard, Michael Pablo, the American Bison Society, and many others managed to help preserve the bison. Allard and Pablo became two of the most successful breeders of buffalo and helped to restock Canada. Basically, the bison had little use. There was no need to use them for hides or meat considering the extremely high profitability of cattle, and as a result there was no reason to expend all of the resources to keep large numbers of them around. That said, the appropriate degree of preservation did occur, and it was started by private entrepreneurs. The wild, wild west really wasn't so wild. Without a state, natives and whites managed to get along well enough. Rabid miners and incoming settlers formed their own voluntary law enforcement agencies. Crime was not commonplace. Private organizations managed water supply, and scarce resources were used in the most economical way they could be used. That said, when the state did get involved, things got worse. Land became harder to irrigate, more crime came about, and wars between settlers and natives became more common. As illustrated, the West is a great example of man voluntarily participating with one another to achieve their own goals, and doing so peacefully. The Wild West is a successful example of anarchy. Hopefully, next time you're telling someone that you're an anarchist and they say something like, "What do you want to do, send us back to the times of the Wild West?" you can happily and confidently say, yes. As a quick end note here, this video is part of a larger series where several different other YouTubers are making videos on anarchy, and not all of them have been released yet. Just keep an eye out for those. All their channels are going to be linked below. You can already see Anglos on Cospaya and Springtime of Nations on this little Mexican example. As far as my next video goes, I'm not entirely sure when I'm going to have that out. It's going to be around 2 hours covering the entirety of the War on Terror, and it's taking me a lot longer to edit than I originally thought. So also keep an eye out for that, and I'll see you in the next video.